The next morning, every newspaper in Britain ran the same headline: Amy Winehouse booed off stage. They had the facts right, but they had the story completely wrong. To understand what actually happened on the night of November 14, 2007, at the National Indoor Arena in Birmingham, you need to start not at the venue, not at the stage door, not even at the hotel where Amy was staying that week. You need to start at a prison on the outskirts of London earlier that same afternoon, where a 24-year-old woman sat in a visiting room and looked at her husband through a partition and tried to hold herself together. Blake Fielder Civil had been arrested 5 days earlier. The charges were serious: obstruction of justice, assault, a web of legal trouble that had been building for months and had finally collapsed into something that could not be managed or minimized or explained away. He was being held on remand. There was no bail. Amy had driven to the prison that afternoon because she was his wife and because not going was not something she was capable of. She sat with him for the time they were given, and then she drove back. That evening, she was supposed to perform. The Birmingham show was the opening night of a 17-date UK tour, the biggest headline run of Amy's career to that point. 50,000 tickets had been sold across the full tour. The venues were the largest she had ever played in Britain. Promoters had spent months building it. Her band had been rehearsing. Everything was in place for what should have been a triumphant homecoming. The artist who had just released the biggest-selling British album of the year returning to the country that had made her and proving on stage exactly why. The people around her knew she should not go on that night. But understanding why she did requires understanding something about Amy's relationship with performing that most people who followed her career never fully grasped. She was not a natural showman in the way that some artists are, the ones who seem to come alive under lights, who draw energy from crowds the way a fire draws oxygen. Amy wrote songs alone and sang them because she could not help singing them. The stage was where the songs had to go. It was not where she lived. Mitch Winehouse wrote in his memoir about his daughter's nervousness before performances, a nervousness that had been with her from the beginning and never really left, that she managed with varying degrees of success depending on what else was happening in her life. In the summer and autumn of 2007, a great deal was happening in her life. None of it was helping. Some of them said so directly. Her tour manager, who would resign of the job within days, understood what the afternoon's visit had done to her. The state she was in when she arrived at the arena was not the state of someone who was ready to stand in front of 11,000 people and perform for 2 hours. She was hollowed out. She was running on something that was not quite strength and not quite desperation, but somewhere in the dark territory between the two. Amy went on anyway. Her spokesman would later explain that it had been entirely her own decision, that she knew how many people had bought tickets, that the thought of those people turning up and finding the show canceled because of her was something she could not bring herself to accept. There was a version of Amy Winehouse that the public rarely got to see clearly in those years, the version that took her responsibility seriously, that felt the weight of other people's expectations as a genuine moral obligation rather than just professional pressure. That version of her walked out onto the Birmingham stage on the night of November 14, 2007, and tried. What the audience saw was not that version. What 11,000 people saw was a woman who was barely present. She slurred through the opening songs. She stumbled. Her voice, that extraordinary instrument that had made critics reach for comparisons they had not used in decades, was somewhere far away from where she was standing. She swore at the crowd. When the booing started, and it started early and it spread quickly, she did not retreat from it. She stood there and she answered it, the way she answered everything, head up, not backing down, making it worse. "If you're booing, you're a mug for buying a ticket," she told the crowd. And then, in the same breath, in a sentence that said more about where her mind was than anything else that night, To all those booing, just wait till my husband gets out of incarceration. The arena responded the way arenas respond when they have decided someone has failed them. More booing, walkouts, people who had saved for months for their tickets pushing toward the exits with the particular grim determination of an audience that has made up its mind. A critic from the Birmingham Mail, who was there that night, wrote his review in language that was not unkind so much as devastated. He said it was one of the saddest nights of his life. He said he had witnessed a supremely talented artist reduced to tears, stumbling around the stage. He said the word unforgivably, and years later, reading it, you wonder if he ever regretted that word. Because here is what was not in any of the reviews, and what the morning headlines did not carry, and what the people who booed and left and asked for refunds, many of whom were entirely within their rights, could not have known in full. The year 2007 had been, for Amy Winehouse, one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can have. She had become, almost overnight, one of the most famous people on the planet, and the machinery of that fame had moved faster than anything in her life had prepared her for. Back to Black had been a phenomenon, not just a successful album, a cultural event, the kind that only happens a few times in a decade. It had found its way into people's lives in the specific and permanent way that only certain music does. Strangers were singing her songs on trains. Her face was on billboards. Prince had asked to collaborate with her. The Recording Academy was preparing to give her 5 of its most prestigious awards. And simultaneously, privately, she was watching her marriage collapse in real time from inside it. The contradiction of those two things, the public triumph and the private devastation, was not something Amy was equipped to carry with grace. She had never been someone who carried things with grace. She carried them with honesty, which is a different skill, and in many ways a harder one. She wrote what she felt. She said what she thought. When she was in pain, it was visible, because she had no mechanism for concealment and no particular desire to develop one. That transparency was the quality that had made Back to Black what it was. It was also the quality that made November 2007 so visible and so painful to witness. Amy Winehouse had spent that afternoon sitting across from her husband in a prison visiting room. She had watched him through a partition and tried to be strong for him, and then driven to Birmingham and put on her stage clothes and walked out in front of 11,000 people and attempted, genuinely, desperately attempted, to give them the show they had paid for. She was 24 years old. She was addicted to substances that had taken hold of her in ways she did not yet fully understand. She was in love with someone she could not reach and could not stop loving and could not protect from the consequences of his own choices. And she went on stage anyway. That is not a story about a diva who let her fans down. That is a story about a person trying to hold too many things at once and dropping all of them in public. Backstage after the show, Amy did not disappear. She stayed. She spoke to people. A member of the support act who encountered her that night described her as strangely composed, not euphoric, not destroyed, but quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have already done the worst thing and are simply waiting to see what comes next. She knew it had gone wrong. She was not someone who needed to be told when something had gone wrong. The tour did not recover. The Glasgow show 2 days later was better. She was more present, more recognizably herself, but the damage from Birmingham had changed the atmosphere. The remaining dates moved under a cloud that never fully lifted. Audiences who had already seen the headlines came to venues uncertain of what they were going to find. Some nights she found something close to her form. Other nights, the distance between who she was on stage and who she was capable of being was visible to everyone in the room. There was one night during the remaining dates, Newcastle, the week after Birmingham, where something shifted. Amy came out and she was present in a way she had not been in Birmingham, focused in a way that reminded everyone in the building why they had come. The set was not perfect, it was ragged in places, but the voice was there, fully and unmistakably, and the audience felt it, and for a couple of hours on a Tuesday night in the northeast of England, the thing that everyone had been hoping for seemed possible. She could still do it. The instrument was intact. The songwriter who had written those songs was still somewhere inside the woman who was struggling to perform them. It was that night, perhaps more than Birmingham, that made the cancellation 2 weeks later feel like genuine loss rather than inevitability. On the 27th of November, 2 weeks after Birmingham, it ended. Amy issued a statement through her management. She was canceling all remaining performances and public appearances for the rest of the year on the advice of her doctor. The statement from concert promoter Live Nation cited the rigors of touring and the intense emotional strain Amy had been under in recent weeks. It was carefully worded. It said the minimum that needed to be said. What it did not say was that the woman it was written about had spent the year being photographed in increasingly desperate states by photographers who followed her every move, that her marriage had disintegrated in public in real time, that the man she had married was in prison, that the album she had written about loving him and losing him had become the biggest-selling British release of the year and was about to win her 5 Grammy Awards, and that none of it, not the success, not the recognition, not the crowds in those enormous arenas, had given her anywhere safe to stand. In the months after the tour collapsed, Amy retreated. She entered a physician-supervised program. Her spokesman said she was channeling her difficulties by writing music, which was, for as long as anyone could remember, what Amy did with the things she could not otherwise carry. She wrote when she was devastated. She had always written when she was devastated. Back to Black had come from devastation. Frank had come from a version of it. The songs that existed in fragments from that period, the sketches of what the third album might have been, came from the same place. There is a detail from that night that never made it into the reviews. During one of the quieter moments in the set, between the booing and the walkouts and the stumbling, Amy stood at the microphone and dedicated a song to Blake. Not with anger, not with defiance, but with a simplicity that silenced at least part of the room for a moment. She said his name, and she sang, and the voice that had been absent for most of the night was briefly, unmistakably present. One person who was there wrote afterward that it was the strangest experience, hearing, inside all that wreckage, the thing that had made them buy the ticket in the first place, just for a moment, just enough to make everything around it more heartbreaking by comparison. A fan who had been at Birmingham that night wrote a letter to a music magazine some weeks later. She said she had been angry when she left the arena. She said she had asked for a refund. But she also said something else. She said she had gone home and put Back to Black on and listened to it from beginning to end, the same album she had heard 100 times before, and something about knowing what she now knew about the woman who had made it had changed the way the song sounded. They sounded, she wrote, like someone telling the truth, even the parts that were hard to hear, especially those parts. That is perhaps the most honest thing anyone said about Amy Winehouse in the aftermath of Birmingham. Not the critics who used words like unforgivable, not the promoters who counted the losses, not the fans who demanded refunds, many of whom were entirely within their rights to be angry because they had paid for something real and received something broken. But the woman who went home and listened and heard, underneath the mess and the stumbling and the swearing at an audience that was booing her, the same voice that had always been there, the same honesty that had made the album what it was, the same person who had driven to a prison that afternoon because she was someone's wife and because not going was not who she was. The headlines the next morning said Amy Winehouse had been booed off stage. They were not wrong, but they were writing about a single night without the faintest idea of the day that came before it, the months that had led to it, or the particular and terrible courage it had taken to walk out there at all. Years later, when people who were not there that night discuss Birmingham, they tend to discuss it as evidence of something, of self-destruction, of addiction, of an artist who squandered her gifts.
And there is truth in some of that. No one who watched Amy Winehouse in the final years of her life could honestly claim that the choices being made were good ones, or that the people around her had nothing to answer for, or that it ended the way it needed to end. But Birmingham, specifically, was something more precise than a symbol of self-destruction. It was a single night in the life of a young woman who had visited her husband in prison that afternoon, and then driven to an arena and stood in front of 11,000 strangers and tried to give them something worth the price of their ticket. She failed. The newspapers documented the failure in considerable detail. What they did not document, because they did not know it, was the afternoon that came before it. She had gone on stage in Birmingham on the worst day of a very bad year, in front of 11,000 people, and she had tried. It had not worked. It had fallen apart in front of everyone. The newspapers had photographed the falling and called it the story. But the story was the trying. It was always the trying. And the people who understood that about her, even the ones who asked for their money back, were the ones who kept listening long after that night was over.